In the decades preceding the Second World War, Germany's military resurgence depended heavily on illusion and improvisation. The Treaty of Versailles had dismantled much of its war industry, limiting production capacity, transport networks, and even stockpiles of fuel and ammunition. Yet, under the Nazi regime, these restrictions were gradually ignored. Between 1933 and 1939, a massive rearmament effort was underway, transforming the Reich from a nation of limited resources into one of formidable military potential. However, this transformation occurred far more rapidly in armament output than in logistical infrastructure. The industrial expansion was concentrated on weapons and armor, not on the rail cars, trucks, or fuel depots necessary to sustain them. The geopolitical context further intensified these weaknesses. Germany's strategic concept was born from the experience of 1918, the belief that another protracted war of attrition would spell national ruin. Hitler and the Wehrmacht's planners thus sought rapid, decisive campaigns, wars that would conclude before supply systems reached exhaustion. Blitzkrieg doctrine, though revolutionary in its tempo, concealed a fragile dependence on speed. The panzer divisions that symbolized German modernity were supported by horse-drawn wagons for most of their logistics. In 1939, over 70% of the German army's transport still relied on animal traction. Fuel reserves were limited. Synthetic oil production could not match consumption beyond a few months of full-scale war. Germany's economic geography compounded these challenges. The Reich lacked domestic oil, rubber, and several key metals. Imports from the Soviet Union temporarily filled some of these gaps after the 1939 Non-Aggression Pact, but this arrangement was politically unstable. Once the invasion of the USSR began in 1941, Germany lost that vital resource stream and had to rely increasingly on the seizure of foreign stockpiles and synthetic substitutes. Each conquered territory provided new resources but also new logistical burdens. Differing rail gauges, damaged infrastructure, partisan disruptions, and extended lines of communication that far exceeded the original logistical planning. In contrast, Germany's opponents, Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually the United States, possessed deeper logistical depth. Britain controlled sea routes and colonial resources. The Soviet Union had vast space and production relocation capacity. The United States operated on an industrial scale unprecedented in history. German planning failed to account for such systemic asymmetries. The Wehrmacht could defeat field armies in short campaigns, but it could not outproduce or outtransport its adversaries over years of global warfare. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the German General Staff recognized some of these vulnerabilities, but underestimated their consequences. The invasions of Poland and France demonstrated the effectiveness of concentrated mechanization and rapid maneuver. Yet they also showed early warning signs: fuel shortages, vehicle breakdowns, and overstretched maintenance units. These signals were largely dismissed as temporary difficulties of success. Few within the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, understood that such temporary problems would become chronic once the front extended beyond Western Europe's dense road and rail systems. The logistical system itself was structurally decentralized. The Wehrmacht's three main branches, Army, Navy, and Luftwaffe, operated under distinct supply administrations, often competing for the same resources. The armaments industry, under Hermann Göring's four-year plan, prioritized political loyalty and industrial quotas over rational coordination, while Albert Speer's later reforms would attempt to centralize and streamline production. By then, the structural weaknesses were deeply entrenched. German logistics were efficient only under conditions of limited distance and rapid victory. When confronted with attrition, blockade, or destruction of infrastructure, they faltered. The population's perception of the war effort also shaped logistical priorities. Nazi propaganda emphasized the invincibility of technology and morale, not the mundane necessity of supply chains. Civilian industries were not fully mobilized until 1943, when the war had already turned decisively against Germany. Until that point, consumer production persisted alongside armaments manufacturing, a reflection of ideological insistence on maintaining civilian comfort to preserve morale. This decision deprived the military of thousands of trucks, spare parts, and tons of fuel that might have extended operational endurance in the field. The consequences of these early choices were not immediately visible. In 1939 and 1940, rapid conquests masked systemic fragility, but the imbalance between Germany's military ambition and logistical capability was already embedded in the structure of its war economy. It was a war machine designed for speed, not sustainability. A weapon sharpened for the short thrust, not the long campaign. The coming years would reveal how decisively that imbalance would shape the course of the Second World War. When the German war machine was unleashed in September 1939, its initial conquests appeared to confirm the superiority of its military system. The invasion of Poland was a demonstration of coordination between air power, mechanized ground forces, and precise communication. Yet, behind the visible speed of the Blitzkrieg lay a fragile supply apparatus. Most divisions advanced with limited fuel stocks, and by the third week of operations, supply convoys struggled to reach forward units. Horses outnumbered trucks by 5 to 1, and the German High Command quickly learned that even rapid victories consumed vast quantities of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts that the Reich's economy was not prepared to replace at such pace. The subsequent campaigns in Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France in 1940 further exposed the imbalance between tactical innovation and logistical endurance. Germany's forces achieved mobility through concentrated effort rather than systemic strength. The Panzer Corps that pierced the French front through the Ardennes were supported by field depots improvised on the move. Once the front lines raced ahead of their supply columns, fuel shortages forced temporary halts, and maintenance units had to cannibalize disabled vehicles to keep others running. Luftwaffe squadrons operating from improvised airfields faced difficulties in replenishing aviation's fuel and ammunition due to overstretched rail connections and inadequate motor transport. The victories were impressive, but they were built on an economy that could not sustain continuous campaigns without pause for reorganization. By mid-1940, with Western Europe subdued, Germany stood as the dominant power on the continent. Yet this triumph masked growing strain. The defeat of France had yielded vast spoils, vehicles, raw materials, industrial plants, but integrating these assets into the German war economy proved slow and complex. French rail networks operated on different administrative systems, and requisition locomotives often broke down under German usage. Occupied populations resisted conscription and exploitation, further reducing the reliability of foreign labor. The Wehrmacht's quartermasters noted increasing delays in shipments of ammunition and fuel to forward depots, even as the next phase of the war was already being planned. The invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, magnified every weakness in the German logistical system. Planners in the OKH, Army High Command, calculated that the campaign would last no more than 5 months, assuming the Red Army collapsed under the initial onslaught. As a result, stockpiles were built for a limited period, and there were no provisions for long-term resupply across the vast distances of the Soviet interior. The decision not to standardize vehicles before the invasion created an array of incompatible truck models from dozens of manufacturers, complicating spare parts production and maintenance. Fuel depots were established near the border, but once the offensive moved hundreds of kilometers east, the transport infrastructure simply could not keep up. The first weeks of Barbarossa demonstrated the same pattern as earlier victories: rapid breakthroughs followed by logistical exhaustion. The Wehrmacht captured enormous quantities of Soviet equipment, but the fuel consumption of advancing panzer divisions outstripped delivery capacity. Soviet rail lines, built to a broader gauge, required conversion before they could carry German trains, a process that took weeks for each sector. Horse-drawn columns trudged through dust and mud to deliver rations and ammunition, while Luftwaffe transport aircraft were diverted from combat missions to supply encircled or isolated formations. The logistical tail stretched thin across thousands of kilometers of hostile territory. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, though suffering catastrophic losses, mobilized its logistical depth. Factories were dismantled and moved east beyond the Urals, reassembling within months to resume production. The contrast was striking. Germany relied on temporary exploitation of captured resources. The Soviet Union built endurance through reorganization. By the winter of 1941, German soldiers at the front faced shortages of winter clothing, fuel, and medical supplies. Supply trains stalled in the snow, trucks froze, and horses died in large numbers. The campaign that was supposed to end in a few months became a struggle for survival amid logistical paralysis. At the same time, the war at sea introduced new complications. The British blockade limited access to overseas raw materials. U-boat campaigns required enormous quantities of specialized fuel and torpedoes, while Allied convoys received increasing protection from aircraft and radar technology. The Kriegsmarine's logistical reach could not match its strategic ambitions, forcing Germany to rely more heavily on overland exploitation of occupied Europe. Yet, even within Europe, transport capacity declined. The prioritization of military freight over civilian goods led to shortages that undermined production in factories dependent on distant suppliers. By 1941, the illusion of a self-sufficient war economy had begun to erode. The Wehrmacht remained tactically formidable, but its strategic freedom was shrinking. Each new victory extended the lines of supply farther, demanding more vehicles, fuel, and labor than the Reich could provide. Their early phase of the war, dazzling in speed and coordination, thus carried within it the seeds of exhaustion. The German army could win battles, but its logistical system could not win a war that refused to end quickly. As Germany's initial conquests settled into occupation and consolidation, the question of sustaining war on a continental scale became the central challenge of its military machine. Strategic planning after 1940 revealed deep contradictions within the German system. The leadership aimed simultaneously at global autarky and continuous offensive warfare, two objectives that could not coexist. While Hitler envisioned an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals, the practical logistics required to support such vast operations were never established. The Wehrmacht's doctrine was designed for rapid campaigns, not for a sustained conflict across multiple theaters. Strategically, the German High Command underestimated the scale of resources modern mechanized war demanded. Fuel was the cornerstone of every campaign. The synthetic oil plants at Leuna, Bohlen, and Politz could produce roughly 6 million tons of fuel per year under optimal conditions, but full mobilization of all armed forces required nearly twice that amount. As early as 1941, the Luftwaffe was forced to restrict training flights, and panzer units rationed maneuver exercises to conserve fuel. Petroleum shortages dictated strategy. The decision to invade the Caucasus in 1942 under Operation Blue was driven less by military necessity than by desperate need for oil fields at Maikop, Grozny, and Baku. Each kilometer gained, however, required exponential increases in transport capacity that Germany simply did not possess. Industrial planning also reflected the same imbalance. The 4-year plan had created vast armament facilities, but neglected the connective tissue of logistics, trucks, locomotives, repair depots, and storage infrastructure. The Wehrmacht entered the Soviet Union with around 600,000 motor vehicles of more than 2,000 different models. This diversity made spare part production chaotic. Workshops in the field had to fabricate components by hand, often salvaging from destroyed vehicles. Albert Speer's later rationalization program would attempt to standardize and simplify production, but by the time these reforms took effect in 1943, the damage was irreparable. Thousands of tanks and aircraft remained inoperable, not for lack of design, but because spare parts and fuel could not reach them. Another critical dimension of German logistics was rail transport. The Reichsbahn, the state railway, was efficient within Europe's core, but struggled with the distances and destruction of the Eastern Front. During Barbarossa, only about 30% of the necessary rolling stock was available for front supply. As Soviet tracks were converted to the narrower German gauge, bottlenecks formed at every transfer point. Trains carrying ammunition and rations often waited days for unloading, due to limited depots or fuel shortages for trucks, to distribute supplies further. The combination of underdeveloped road networks, unreliable weather, and partisan sabotage transformed every logistical corridor into a contested front of its own. The human factor compounded these problems. Germany relied heavily on forced labor from occupied territories to compensate for manpower diverted to the front. By 1942, more than 7 million foreign workers were employed in German industry, many under harsh conditions that reduced efficiency and morale. Food and housing shortages diminished productivity, while Allied bombing raids on industrial centers further disrupted transport and communications. The gap between the theoretical capacity of the German economy and its actual performance widened each year. Speer's ministry struggled to coordinate thousands of subcontractors competing for the same raw materials, while military commands demanded immediate deliveries impossible to meet under constant air raids. Strategic misjudgments and production priorities worsened the imbalance. German planning emphasized qualitative superiority, advanced tanks like the Panther and Tiger, or heavy bombers like the He-177, at the expense of quantity and maintainability. These complex machines consumed more fuel and required more maintenance than simpler Allied counterparts. The American M4 Sherman or Soviet T-34 could be produced in tens of thousands and repaired with minimal effort. German armored divisions, by contrast, frequently operated at half strength, with dozens of vehicles immobilized by mechanical failure or lack of parts. By 1943, the average operational rate of German tanks on the Eastern Front rarely exceeded 60%. Political interference further undermined logistical planning. Hitler's direct involvement in production and allocation decisions bypassed professional logisticians. Resources were shifted according to political prestige, favoring Wunderwaffe projects like the V-2 rocket or the Me-262 jet, rather than practical supply needs. These technological ambitions absorbed scarce fuel and metals, leaving conventional units undersupplied. The result was a paradox. Germany fielded some of the most advanced weapons of the war, but lacked the trucks and rails to deliver ammunition to frontline infantry. As the war expanded into North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Balkans, the logistical strain multiplied. Supplying the Africa Corps required long, vulnerable sea routes through the Mediterranean, where British naval dominance ensured heavy losses. Even at its peak, Rommel's army received only a fraction of its required tonnage of fuel and ammunition. Every victory on land depended on shipments that could be intercepted or destroyed before reaching the coast. The logistical equation turned every theater into an exercise in diminishing returns. By 1942, the German leadership was no longer planning how to sustain war. It was improvising how to postpone collapse. Strategic goals, once ambitious and ideological, had become constrained by material reality. Germany's logistical system, designed for conquest, was being consumed by the empire it had created. Each new campaign added demands that the industrial and transport infrastructure could not fulfill. The war of movement that had dazzled Europe in 1939 to 1940 was transforming into a war of supply, one Germany was not prepared to win. When the German war effort reached its operational zenith in 1941 and 1942, the logistical imbalance that had been hidden behind early victories began to manifest in the field with relentless clarity. The Wehrmacht's first great campaigns had depended on speed and shock, but once momentum slowed, the entire apparatus of supply revealed its fragility. The Eastern Front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, consumed more resources than any theater of war in history. Each division required tons of ammunition, fuel, and food every day. Yet the supply system behind them was still operating as though the campaign would end in months, not years. The initial engagements of Barbarossa displayed this contradiction in stark form. German spearheads advanced hundreds of kilometers, enveloping Soviet armies at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kyiv. Each encirclement yielded vast numbers of prisoners and captured equipment, but these victories created their own logistical crises. Supply convoys lagged far behind the front, moving over unpaved roads that turned to mud after the summer rains. Trucks broke down by the thousands. Fuel depots were left hundreds of kilometers to the rear. The Luftwaffe attempted to bridge the gap with air supply, but its transport fleet was far too small. By August 1941, many panzer divisions were operating with less than half their authorized fuel. Operational pauses became necessary, not for tactical regrouping, but for resupply. As German forces pushed toward Moscow, logistical strain turned into paralysis. The Soviet rail system, operating on a different gauge, slowed the transfer of supplies. Engineers worked day and night to convert lines, but capacity never matched the pace of advance. Horses, still the backbone of the German army's logistics, died in staggering numbers from exhaustion and disease. Units scavenged local resources, confiscating grain and livestock from villages to sustain themselves. This practice fed troops temporarily, but alienated the civilian population, strengthening partisan resistance that would soon target German supply routes. By the onset of winter, the army that had begun the invasion with precision timetables was living from day to day, its fuel tanks nearly empty and its soldiers without proper clothing or rations. The opening clashes before Moscow in late 1941 illustrated the limits of the Blitzkrieg model. The Wehrmacht could no longer rely on rapid concentration to achieve victory. It had outrun its capacity to sustain itself. Entire panzer corps stood idle while their fuel was diverted to other sectors. Ammunition trains froze on sidings, and supply officers recorded shortages of nearly every essential item: machine gun belts, radio batteries, replacement boots. In the cold, lubricants congealed and vehicles refused to start. The German command's insistence on continuing offensive operations through the winter, driven by ideological conviction rather than material calculation, only deepened the crisis. When Soviet counterattacks began in December 1941, the logistical collapse transformed tactical withdrawals into chaotic retreats. Parallel difficulties arose in other theaters. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps fought with skill, but without adequate supply. The ports of Tripoli and Benghazi could not handle the tonnage needed to sustain the panzer divisions, and the long overland haul across the desert consumed more fuel than it delivered. British naval and air superiority compounded the problem. Italian transport convoys lost up to 40% of their cargoes before reaching Africa. Rommel's operations at Tobruk, Gazala, and El Alamein were constrained less by the enemy's strength than by the absence of petrol and ammunition. The same shortage afflicted the Luftwaffe's North African wings, whose aircraft often sat grounded due to lack of aviation fuel. On the Eastern Front in 1942, logistical planning was again subordinated to ambition. Hitler's directive for the summer offensive, Operation Blue, aimed simultaneously at Stalingrad and the Caucasus, dividing resources between two objectives separated by hundreds of kilometers. The German Quartermaster General, Edward Wagner, warned that available transport could not support both thrusts, but his concerns were ignored. The rail network behind Army Group South was still under reconstruction, and the motor pool was depleted. Nevertheless, the campaign went forward. Initially, the advance succeeded, but as the front extended deeper into the steppe, every kilometer became a logistical burden. Deliveries of fuel and ammunition fell to less than half of requirements by August. Units were forced to cannibalize vehicles to keep others moving. The encirclement of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad later that year was the inevitable outcome of these logistical realities. The army, trapped far from supply depots, depended on airlift for survival. Goering promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies per day, but the Luftwaffe could manage scarcely a third of that, even under ideal conditions. Snow, fog, and Soviet anti-aircraft fire reduced deliveries further. Soldiers starved and froze as aircraft arrived irregularly, often carrying non-essential items like radio batteries instead of food or fuel. The failure to sustain the Stalingrad pocket was not merely a tactical defeat. It was the culmination of systemic weaknesses that had defined German logistics since the start of the war. By 1943, these problems could no longer be concealed. The Wehrmacht was fighting multiple large-scale fronts with an economy already overstretched and infrastructure crumbling under Allied bombing. The Eastern Front consumed the majority of Germany's transport capacity, leaving little for other theaters. Fuel shortages became chronic. By mid-1943, tank crews were limited to minimal driving hours to conserve supplies. Airfields lacked spare parts, and aircraft were cannibalized for engines. Trains carrying supplies to the front were increasingly attacked by Soviet partisans, who destroyed bridges and rail junctions faster than they could be repaired. Every attempt to restore mobility was met with the same result. The further Germany expanded, the weaker its logistical base became. In this phase, the clash between Germany's operational excellence and logistical incapacity was fully exposed. The Wehrmacht could still plan and execute complex maneuvers, but without the means to sustain them. The concept of total war, which demanded the integration of economy, production, and military effort, was never achieved in Germany until it was too late. The country that had once prided itself on precision engineering and organization was now improvising survival in a war it could no longer afford to move. By 1943, the German war machine had reached a point where logistical survival required constant improvisation. The crisis was not one of competence, but of capacity. The Reich's resources, already strained by years of continuous warfare, could no longer sustain the demands of fighting on multiple fronts. Every phase of the conflict had widened the gap between operational ambition and material reality. As the Eastern Front expanded and the Western Allies intensified bombing campaigns, Germany's logistical infrastructure began to collapse from both overextension and systematic destruction. The Battle of Stalingrad marked the psychological and logistical turning point. The loss of the Sixth Army was not simply a military catastrophe. It revealed the structural impossibility of maintaining extended operations without secure supply chains. Fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe's capacity to maintain air superiority, while the Red Army's growing mechanization increased its own logistical resilience. Soviet industry, relocated beyond the Volga and Ural regions, produced a steady flow of equipment that could be delivered by rail over secured routes. Germany, by contrast, faced shrinking output and growing transport bottlenecks. The Reichsbahn's capacity had fallen by nearly 30% compared to 1941, largely due to the destruction of locomotives and tracks under Allied air attack. The crisis deepened further after the defeat at Kursk in July 1943. The massive concentration of armor in that battle required an enormous logistical effort, more than 2,500 tanks, 10,000 guns, and millions of shells. The outcome demonstrated that Germany could still assemble striking power for individual operations, but doing so exhausted reserves to the point of strategic paralysis. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht lacked the means to rebuild its mechanized strength at the same scale. Fuel consumption outpaced synthetic production, and every month saw reductions in the allocation of petrol for training, transportation, and even essential civilian services. Rail transport, once the backbone of German logistics, was increasingly disrupted by Allied bombers targeting marshalling yards, bridges, and industrial hubs. The Allied bombing offensive introduced a new dimension to the logistical war. Beginning in 1943, the systematic destruction of Germany's oil industry became a central priority for the RAF and US AAF. Raids on Ploiești in Romania, as well as on synthetic fuel plants in Leuna, Merseburg, and Blechhammer, sharply reduced production. In 1944, output fell by more than half. The effect was immediate and devastating. Panzer divisions were immobilized, Luftwaffe sorties dropped drastically, and transport operations ground to a halt. The shortage of high-octane aviation fuel rendered Germany's most advanced aircraft, the Me-262 jets and Refusum 90 fighters, practically useless as sustained operations. Even basic supply missions became impossible in many regions. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army's logistical superiority became decisive. Soviet offensives were preceded by massive stockpiling of ammunition and fuel along purpose-built rail lines. Germany lacked the equivalent capacity to shift reserves efficiently. The retreat from the Dnieper in late 1943 forced the Wehrmacht to abandon thousands of tons of equipment simply because transport could not be arranged in time. The loss of occupied territories also meant the loss of vital agricultural and industrial resources that had temporarily sustained the war economy. Ukraine's coal and grain, Romania's oil, and Hungary's metals had been critical to German production. Their gradual loss further unbalanced the system. In the Mediterranean, the collapse of Axis logistics followed a similar trajectory. After the defeat in North Africa and the invasion of Italy, German forces faced the challenge of defending long, narrow peninsulas under constant aerial interdiction. Every movement of men or materiel south of Rome risked annihilation from Allied bombers. Supply convoys from the north were systematically destroyed before reaching the front. 1/10 of requirements, grounding most aircraft. The Wehrmacht, once known for its precision and efficiency, now depended on scavenged Allied stockpiles and captured vehicles to keep its divisions moving. Inside Germany, the civilian economy entered a state of exhaustion. The mobilization decrees of 1943 and 1944 placed the entire population under wartime regulation, but even total mobilization could not overcome material scarcity. Bombing raids paralyzed rail traffic and forced factories to relocate or operate at reduced capacity. Coal shortages curtailed electricity generation, disrupting production across entire regions. Repair crews worked continuously to restore tracks and bridges, but the pace of destruction exceeded repair. The armaments miracle attributed to Albert Speer was more a reallocation of dwindling resources than a true increase in productivity. Germany's industrial output remained impressive in certain sectors, yet the distribution system, the lifeline that turned production into usable power, was disintegrating. The Wehrmacht's field logistics reflected this broader decay. Supply officers reported fuel rations cut by half, ammunition deliveries delayed for weeks, and replacement vehicles unavailable. Frontline commanders increasingly relied on requisition, seizure, or barter with local populations. Partisan activity behind the lines made movement perilous. Attacks on trains and depots forced the diversion of entire divisions to security duties. In occupied Poland and Belarus, entire sectors became logistical black holes, where supplies vanished into sabotage or corruption. By 1944, German divisions on the Eastern Front were routinely operating at less than 70% of their authorized strength in vehicles and heavy weapons. Politically, Hitler's insistence on holding territory at all costs worsened logistical inefficiency. Retreats were forbidden even when supply lines collapsed, forcing armies to consume their own transport capacity in futile defensive efforts. The result was a pattern of localized encirclements and massive material losses. The once fluid doctrine of movement had degenerated into static defense, where logistics no longer supported strategy but dictated it. The war that Germany had begun as a triumph of planning and mechanized precision had become a desperate struggle to distribute the last remaining resources before total collapse. By 1944, the German war effort had reached its peak in size, but its nadir in sustainability. The logistical system, once able to support lightning offensives across Europe, was now disintegrating under pressure from every direction. The Wehrmacht faced the impossible task of maintaining over 400 divisions across multiple fronts, from northern Norway to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic coast to the Vistula, with a transport network that could no longer deliver the essentials of modern warfare. The war of maneuver had become a war of attrition, and Germany's logistical structure, never designed for endurance, began to collapse in full view. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had achieved what no battlefield defeat alone could accomplish. It crippled the Reich's transport and fuel systems. The systematic destruction of railways, marshalling yards, and oil refineries created an internal paralysis that military command could not remedy. In early 1944, Allied bombers shifted focus toward what they called the transportation plan. They targeted the connective arteries of the German war economy, bridges, tunnels, and repair depots, turning supply into chaos. Within months, freight movement dropped by nearly half. Factories still capable of producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery found that their products could not reach the front. Warehouses overflowed with unused material, while field armies ran short of ammunition and food. The effects were most visible in the Luftwaffe, which, by mid-1944, had lost the ability to sustain flight operations. The production of aviation fuel had fallen to less than 10% of 1943 levels after repeated raids on synthetic plants. Jet aircraft like the Me-2, 6-2 stood idle for lack of kerosene, while conventional bombers were grounded en masse. Pilots were trained hastily and flew fewer hours due to fuel rationing, eroding combat effectiveness. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect German cities and troops allowed Allied bombers to operate almost unopposed, compounding the logistical crisis by further destroying infrastructure and morale. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army's advance into Ukraine and Belarus in 1944 exposed the Wehrmacht's terminal weakness in supply. Operation Bagration, launched in June, destroyed the central portion of the German front within weeks. Soviet forces, supplied by massive logistical preparations involving thousands of locomotives and motorized columns, advanced faster than Germany could retreat. Entire German corps were encircled because transport columns could no longer move ammunition and fuel in time to support withdrawals. The retreating divisions burned their own vehicles for lack of petrol, abandoning artillery and heavy equipment. The same process repeated in the Baltic states and Poland. The Wehrmacht was no longer defeated solely by combat, but by starvation of mobility. The Western Front suffered an equally devastating logistical collapse. After the Allied landings in Normandy, German defenders found themselves unable to coordinate reinforcements or counterattacks effectively. Allied air dominance made daytime transport suicidal. Each movement of a convoy or train invited destruction from above. Bridges over the Seine and Loire were repeatedly bombed, severing the lines between northern France and Germany. The panzer divisions assembled for counteroffensives, such as at Mortagne or in the Ardennes later that year, received only fractions of their required fuel allocations. During the Ardennes offensive, the last major German attack in the west, many tanks were abandoned simply because fuel trucks could not reach them. The entire operation, though daring in conception, was doomed by logistics before it began. Inside Germany, the civilian infrastructure mirrored the military collapse. The Reichsbahn's network was in ruins. Over 35,000 kilometers of track had been destroyed or rendered inoperable. Coal shipments failed to reach power stations, cutting electricity to armament plants. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin operated under constant disruption. Refugees fleeing the front lines overwhelmed the transport system, competing with military supply trains for dwindling capacity. Hospitals ran out of medical supplies. Rationing of food and heating fuel became severe. The population's endurance, once buoyed by propaganda and discipline, deteriorated under the combined strain of hunger, cold, and bombing. In an attempt to stabilize the front, Albert Speer introduced emergency measures to centralize control over all transport and resources. He created the Central Planning Board to allocate fuel, coal, and raw materials according to strategic necessity. But these measures arrived too late. The Allied air forces adjusted their targets dynamically, striking at every repair effort. The loss of Ploiești's oil fields in August 1944, following Romania's defection, delivered a final blow to Germany's energy supply. From that point, the Reich was dependent almost entirely on the dwindling output of synthetic fuel plants operating under constant bombardment. By autumn, even high command vehicles were limited to essential travel only. The morale of frontline troops began to erode as supply lines disintegrated. Units often received rations only every few days, and ammunition shortages forced infantry to limit fire during engagements. The once meticulous German supply chain was reduced to improvisation. Bicycles, ox-drawn carts, and requisitioned civilian vehicles filled the gaps left by destroyed motor transport. The German army, once the embodiment of mechanized warfare, was reverting to pre-industrial methods of movement. Partisan activity and advancing Allied forces ensured that even these makeshift systems were precarious. The Wehrmacht had become a stranded force, dependent on a logistical structure that no longer existed. In the broader strategic sense, logistics had ceased to be a supporting factor and had become the central determinant of Germany's fate. Every remaining decision, whether to hold, retreat, or counterattack, revolved around fuel and transport availability. Hitler's orders to defend fortress cities only accelerated depletion by trapping garrisons in isolated pockets that consumed supplies without contributing to overall defense. The collapse of coordination between the army, industry, and transport ministries created a fragmented command system where each fought for resources the Reich no longer had. The peak of the campaign, once measured in territorial gains and operational tempo, was now defined by the sheer impossibility of sustaining movement. Germany's military machine, still powerful in appearance, had become an empty shell, its strength consumed not by enemy fire alone, but by the slow suffocation of its logistical heart. As 1944 drew toward its end, the German state entered a phase of desperate adaptation. What had once been a meticulously organized war machine was now an assemblage of emergency improvisations. The Wehrmacht's logistics, once driven by doctrine, were replaced by survival instinct. Every division, every city, and every ministry was compelled to invent its own means of functioning amid scarcity. The Reich's leadership called it total war, but in practice it was an attempt to hold a collapsing system together with fragments of organization, forced labor, and dwindling materials. The illusion of control persisted only through fear and propaganda. The material basis of warfare had already eroded beyond recovery. The collapse of fuel production forced sweeping improvisations across all branches of the armed forces. The once mobile panzer divisions were gradually transformed into static defensive units. Vehicles were hidden in barns or forests to conserve the last reserves of fuel for emergency use. Some divisions resorted to using captured Allied or Soviet vehicles, whose differing specifications only worsened the maintenance crisis. Supply depots hoarded what they could, issuing rations by the liter or kilogram. By late 1944, the average German division on the Eastern Front received less than one-third of its official fuel allowance. Commanders adjusted strategy to reality. Operations were planned not by geography or objectives, but by how far available fuel could carry the army before it would be forced to stop. In the air, similar desperation prevailed. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots flew sporadically, conserving fuel for critical defensive operations. Sorties were limited to intercepting Allied bombers threatening key industrial or population centers. Training for new pilots was drastically shortened, and ground crews scavenged parts from wrecked aircraft to keep others flying. The result was a hollowed-out force, technically advanced but operationally crippled. The once feared German air fleet was reduced to fragments of activity, unable to influence the outcome of battles on either front. Even when jet fighters like the Me-262 became operational, logistical barriers rendered them strategically irrelevant. They could take off, but had nowhere to refuel or rearm in sufficient quantity to matter. On the ground, the improvisation extended to supply methods. Rail transport, shattered by Allied bombing and partisan attacks, operated through a patchwork of emergency repairs. Local engineers and soldiers used wooden rails, hand-pumped trolleys, and improvised bridges to keep lines barely functional. Entire trains were assembled from mismatched carriages and locomotives salvaged from occupied countries. Trucks ran on producer gas systems, a mixture of wood or coal gases, as a substitute for gasoline. These measures kept minimal supplies flowing, but at a fraction of the efficiency needed to sustain large-scale operations. The German army was living on the edge of collapse, moving ammunition and rations in quantities measured by survival, not by strategy. Civilian participation in logistics became increasingly pronounced. The regime conscripted millions of men and women for labor in armament factories and transport services. Teenagers and elderly men were drafted into the Volkssturm, tasked with defending rail junctions and fuel depots. Civilians collected scrap metal, wood, and anything that could substitute for critical materials. Urban transport systems were cannibalized for spare parts to maintain military vehicles. Yet, despite this mobilization, output continued to decline. The problem was no longer lack of labor, but the impossibility of distributing resources under continuous bombardment and disintegration of infrastructure. The war economy had become circular, producing weapons that could not be fueled vehicles that could not reach the front, and frontline troops that could not be supplied. In the occupied territories still under German control, local logistics broke down entirely. In the Balkans, Greece, and parts of Yugoslavia, partisans cut railways daily, and convoys required armed escort. In Hungary and Slovakia, where German forces fought desperate defensive battles, fuel and ammunition were rationed to the last liter and cartridge. By 1945, the remnants of Army Group Southeast were dependent on horse carts and requisitioned farm vehicles. The same situation prevailed in the North, where Army Group North was effectively isolated in the Courland Pocket, supplied sporadically by sea under constant Soviet air attacks. Even these sea routes were shrinking. Allied naval dominance had turned the Baltic and Adriatic into death traps for transport vessels. The human cost of this logistical breakdown was immense. Soldiers went hungry for days, relying on local scavenging or seized civilian supplies. Medical services disintegrated as hospital trains and field depots ran out of morphine, bandages, and fuel for generators. Wounded men were left untreated or transported in unheated wagons over long distances. Disease spread in the ranks as hygiene deteriorated. Frostbite, dysentery, and exhaustion became endemic. The German frontline soldier of 1945 was no longer supported by the vast bureaucratic apparatus of the early war. He was sustained only by endurance and the will to survive. The myth of military precision gave way to the reality of starvation and disorganization. Meanwhile, Speer's ministry attempted to maintain production through decentralization, moving factories underground or into rural areas less exposed to air raids. Though these efforts allowed some continuity, they complicated logistics further. Underground factories lacked efficient transport links, forcing reliance on small-scale truck convoys and manual loading. Many of these facilities depended on concentration camp labor, adding moral atrocity to logistical desperation. Prisoners died by the tens of thousands producing aircraft parts and munitions that could no longer alter the war's course. In these final months, Germany's logistics had turned cannibalistic, feeding on human life to sustain a military system that was already disintegrating. By the beginning of 1945, the Reich existed in fragments. Communications between the fronts broke down, telegraph lines were cut, radio networks jammed or destroyed. Regional commanders operated independently, making supply decisions without central oversight. The once feared German general staff could no longer coordinate nationwide logistics. Armies fought not as parts of a coherent machine, but as isolated organisms struggling to survive. Every surviving depot, fuel drum, and train car became an object of strategic importance. The improvisation that had once been Germany's temporary solution had become its defining condition, a tragic testament to a state that had mastered the art of war but lost the science of sustaining it. The final phase of Germany's logistical collapse unfolded between January and April 1945, when the war's outcome was already certain, yet fighting continued with mechanical persistence. The Reich, once capable of launching simultaneous campaigns across continents, now resembled a besieged fortress with its arteries cut. Supply networks disintegrated under constant bombardment, rail lines lay twisted and burned, and the few remaining depots were overrun or abandoned. The Wehrmacht, no longer a coherent army, fought in disconnected fragments, each unit scavenging what it could from the ruins of a continent it had once conquered. The question was no longer how to win the war, but how long movement, communication, and supply could continue before ceasing altogether. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945 advanced more than 500 kilometers in less than a month, destroying Germany's last organized logistics in the east. Depots near Warsaw, Łódź, and Poznan were captured almost intact, exposing how fragile the entire system had become. In many cases, fuel and ammunition stockpiles had been left behind because the Wehrmacht lacked the transport capacity to evacuate them. Retreating units relied on whatever could be salvaged locally: civilian vehicles, horses, even bicycles. Soviet forces, by contrast, advanced on well-prepared supply routes supported by American trucks from the Lend-Lease program. The logistical asymmetry between the two sides had grown absolute. Germany could no longer feed its armies, while the Red Army could deliver supplies to its front faster than Germany could retreat. Inside the Reich, chaos reigned. Allied bombers had reduced major rail junctions to rubble. Cities such as Dresden, Cologne, and Kassel, once vital logistical hubs, became wastelands of collapsed bridges and impassable streets. The destruction of marshalling yards at Hamm, Mannheim, and Munich in early 1945 paralyzed internal transport completely. Freight trains that once carried ammunition and rations to the front were now immobile carcasses under open sky, their locomotives stripped for parts. Civilians attempting to flee the eastern territories clogged the remaining rail lines, further hindering military transport. In many regions, the frontline soldiers and refugees competed for the same scarce fuel and space, symbolizing the complete fusion of civilian and military desperation. The Western Front offered no respite. After the Allied breakthrough across the Rhine in March 1945, the last coherent logistical corridors to the west collapsed. The Ruhr industrial basin, Germany's heart of coal and steel production, was encircled by Allied forces, cutting off fuel and munitions to the remaining armies. Wehrmacht divisions on the Western Front were forced to fight with dwindling ammunition and ration reserves measured in days. Fuel rations were reduced to a few liters per vehicle. Some tank units disguised immobile Panthers and Tigers as functioning defenses, placing them in static positions as makeshift bunkers. The image of armored divisions without mobility captured the final absurdity of the logistical war. The machines of conquest had become monuments to a vanished power. At the same time, Germany's command structure disintegrated under the weight of its own isolation. Communications between the High Command in Berlin and the front lines became intermittent. Orders were transmitted by courier or unreliable radio links. Speer's ministry continued to issue production reports and allocation plans that bore no relation to field reality. The bureaucracy of war still produced paperwork, requisitions, tonnage estimates, and rail schedules for a network that no longer existed. In some cases, these plans were executed on paper long after the actual depots had been destroyed or captured. The disconnection between planning and reality illustrated the total collapse of logistical coherence. The German war machine had turned into a ghost, its form still visible, but its substance gone. In these final months, the nature of supply itself transformed. The Reich's armies no longer relied on organized distribution, but on what soldiers called war on one's own resources. Units stripped towns of anything usable, furniture burned as fuel, civilian vehicles dismantled for spare parts, and livestock slaughtered for rations. Soldiers melted snow for water, repaired uniforms with scraps, and traded with civilians to survive. Frontline formations were frequently cut off from higher command for weeks, subsisting entirely on what they could find. The traditional distinction between combat and logistics disappeared. Every man became his own supply officer. In this state, the Wehrmacht ceased to function as a modern army and reverted to the elemental struggle of survival. The Allied armies, by contrast, demonstrated the full maturity of modern logistics. American and British forces operated on a scale that dwarfed anything in history. Truck convoys, the Red Ball Express and its successors, delivered thousands of tons of supplies daily across well-secured routes. Air transport units could establish new depots within days of a breakthrough. The contrast was total. While Germany's soldiers pushed carts over broken roads, their opponents delivered entire armored divisions by train and aircraft. The war of logistics had been decided not by tactics, but by systems, and the German system had imploded under the combined stress of overreach, bombardment, and blockade. As the Soviet forces closed in on Berlin in April 1945, the last remnants of the German logistical network vanished. The capital's defenders received sporadic deliveries of ammunition and food through improvised convoys or small aircraft landing in the Tiergarten at night. Fuel was almost non-existent. Tanks stood motionless as fixed fortifications. Artillery fired its last shells with no replacement expected. Civilians scavenged ruins for food, while soldiers searched abandoned depots for cartridges. The city that had once directed the mechanized conquest of Europe now fought with whatever fragments of its own collapse remained. The Wehrmacht, once celebrated for its organization and precision, ended in silence, a vast machine without fuel, direction, or coherence. By the time of surrender in May 1945, Germany's logistical network had ceased to exist, not only physically, but institutionally. Railways, depots, and ministries lay in ruins, their personnel scattered or captured. Millions of tons of supplies were stranded across Europe, uncollected, unreachable, or destroyed. The final months revealed with merciless clarity that industrial warfare was not merely about weapons and armies, but about systems of movement, fuel, and replacement. Once those systems failed, even the strongest army became powerless. Germany had not only lost the war of arms, it had lost the war of logistics, the quiet but decisive front upon which its entire military ambition had depended. When the fighting finally subsided in May 1945, the wreckage of Germany's logistical system lay scattered across the continent. The end of combat did not immediately bring order, but exposed the full scale of collapse that had long been hidden by the front lines. Thousands of derailed trains, rusting vehicles, and abandoned depots stretched from France to the Vistula. The very arteries that had once carried the supplies of conquest now lay clogged with ruins. In these final weeks and their aftermath, the story of Germany's defeat became one of paralysis, improvisation, and starvation. A nation reduced to fragments of its former industrial power, incapable of feeding its armies or even its people. The retreat of 1945 was not a coordinated withdrawal, but a sequence of dissolutions. Armies ceased to exist as organized entities and instead fragmented into pockets attempting to reach the West, to surrender to the Allies rather than the advancing Soviets. The logistics of surrender themselves became chaotic. Roads filled with endless columns of refugees, retreating soldiers, and horse-drawn carts carrying what little remained of military stores. Ammunition dumps were abandoned and often detonated to prevent capture. In many areas, Wehrmacht officers destroyed fuel reserves to deny them to the enemy, leaving their own troops stranded. Bridges were blown up to slow pursuit, severing the last operational supply routes within the Reich. What remained of the transport system was consumed by the final defensive battles and the mass movement of civilians fleeing from the east. Within Germany's cities, the civilian population entered a new kind of siege. Allied bombing had reduced industrial centers to rubble, and transportation between regions became nearly impossible. Coal could not reach power plants. Food could not reach urban centers. Starvation became widespread during the final months. The collapse of the rationing system left millions dependent on improvised trade, scavenging, and charity from the remaining local administrations. Hospitals operated without electricity, relying on candles and makeshift medical supplies. Diseases such as typhus spread in refugee camps where sanitation was non-existent. The war had not only destroyed Germany's armies, but had unmade its capacity for organized life. The Allied occupation forces faced an unprecedented logistical challenge of their own, managing the ruins of the defeated system. In the West, American and British forces quickly assumed control of remaining infrastructure to deliver food, restore minimal transport, and handle millions of prisoners of war. In the East, the Soviets took over entire industrial complexes, dismantling machinery for transport to the USSR as reparations. German railway workers, engineers, and truck drivers were pressed into service under Allied command to move relief supplies through devastated territories. For months, starvation threatened entire cities until emergency feeding programs began to stabilize conditions. Ironically, the very nations that had destroyed Germany's logistics now had to rebuild them to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. The destruction of the Reichsbahn was one of the most striking indicators of total collapse. Once the pride of German engineering, the railway network had been the central pillar of every military operation. By 1945, it was reduced to a tangle of bomb craters, twisted rails, and burned-out locomotives. Allied engineers estimated that more than half of all rolling stock had been destroyed or rendered unusable. The surviving trains often ran at walking speed over temporary repairs. Freight yards that had once dispatched thousands of tons of supplies daily were silent except for scavengers dismantling wreckage for scrap. This paralysis of movement marked the definitive end of Germany's ability to wage or even sustain war. The Wehrmacht's logistical corps, once admired for precision, dissolved into captivity along with the rest of the army. In Allied prisoner camps, captured quartermasters described how requisition orders had become meaningless in the final months. Supplies existed only on paper. Entire divisions were marked as equipped when, in reality, they possessed neither transport nor ammunition. Some admitted to burning their own records to conceal the chaos. The final reports of the German High Command spoke of non-existent deliveries and collapsed coordination. Logistics, which had once defined Germany's strength, ended in bureaucratic fiction. Reports written for a chain of command that no longer controlled anything. The material consequences of the logistical collapse were matched by moral and psychological exhaustion. Soldiers who had fought for years returned to find no homes, no functioning economy, and no means of transport. The industrial regions of the Ruhr, Saxony, and Silesia were in ruins. Rural areas struggled to feed themselves as millions of forced laborers, prisoners, and displaced persons moved chaotically through the countryside. Former depots became refugee camps. Carts made from dismantled truck chassis carried the belongings of entire families. In every direction, movement replaced order. Germany became a country in transit, its people traveling without destination across the wreckage of their own creation. In strategic retrospect, the logistical defeat of Germany became a case study in the limits of military power, detached from material sustainability. The Wehrmacht had fought with skill and discipline, but its structure depended on a supply system that could never meet the demands of a global war. Every victory had extended its lines of communication further, and every extension had accelerated the process of exhaustion. By the end, Germany's armies were not defeated merely by superior numbers or technology, but by the systemic implosion of their logistical foundation. Tanks without fuel, aircraft without kerosene, and railways without coal. These became the true emblems of defeat. The withdrawal and surrender phase closed the cycle that had begun 6 years earlier with Blitzkrieg and rapid mobility. What started as an experiment in the acceleration of war ended in complete stillness. The same railways that had once carried panzers to France and Poland now lay silent under Allied guard. The highways that had symbolized national pride and efficiency were filled with abandoned vehicles. The German war of logistics, fought invisibly behind every front line, had concluded not with a battle, but with exhaustion. In the ruins of the Reich, no army remained to move, no fuel to burn, and no system to sustain even the act of surrender. In the aftermath of the war, Germany's defeat in the realm of logistics became one of the most studied and revealing aspects of the Second World War. The ruins of its infrastructure told a story not only of military collapse, but of the limits of industrial ambition. For a nation that had once prided itself on engineering precision and organizational efficiency, the logistical implosion of 1945 was both a material and ideological reckoning. It demonstrated that no amount of tactical brilliance or technological innovation could overcome the constraints of production, fuel, and transport. The Wehrmacht's downfall was not a failure of soldiers or machines alone. It was the failure of a system that had overreached its material base. The legacy of this collapse shaped both post-war reconstruction and historical understanding. Allied investigators, analyzing the remains of German industry, found that much of its armament production had remained impressive until the very end, but transport and fuel shortages rendered it meaningless. Speer's so-called armament miracle in 1943 to 1944 had masked the deeper truth. Production was not the same as delivery. Factories could produce tanks, but not the gasoline to move them. Aircraft, but not the synthetic fuel to fly them. Artillery shells, but not the trains to bring them to the front. The illusion of efficiency had been maintained through statistical manipulation and propaganda, while the physical system that sustained war steadily rotted away beneath the surface. In the broader context of modern warfare, Germany's defeat underscored the primacy of logistics as the true engine of victory. The Allies' success was built not only on superior numbers or technological advantages, but on the creation of a vast, integrated network of supply that spanned oceans and continents. American industrial power, British maritime control, and Soviet strategic depth combined into a logistical framework that dwarfed anything Germany could achieve. The ability to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted, to move resources seamlessly from factory to front, and to sustain armies thousands of kilometers from home became the defining factor of the war. Germany had entered the conflict, believing speed and daring could compensate for material shortage. By 1945, that belief had been proven fatal. The post-war occupation revealed how deeply the logistics failure had penetrated civilian life. Allied administrators who took control of Germany found a country not merely defeated, but immobilized. Rail networks functioned at a fraction of capacity. Bridges lay in rivers, highways were cratered and impassable. Coal mining had halted due to lack of transport and power, causing further energy shortages that crippled reconstruction. For months, entire regions survived only through emergency food shipments organized by the Allies. The Marshall Plan that would follow in later years was, in essence, a logistical reconstruction program, rebuilding not only factories but the means of distribution that defined modern economic life. The Allies understood that without movement, no recovery was possible. In historical memory, the German War of Logistics also became a moral narrative. The same state that had mastered bureaucratic organization for conquest and occupation had destroyed itself by the same mechanisms of control. The regime's obsession with production quotas, centralized command, and ideological purity had suffocated flexibility and adaptation. Civilian industries that could have sustained transport or energy were subordinated to projects of prestige and terror. The immense resources spent on Wunderwaffe weapons, rockets, and jets could not substitute for a coherent supply chain. The collapse of logistics was, in this sense, a reflection of the Nazi system itself, rigid, hierarchical, and incapable of self-correction. For military historians and planners, the lessons were clear. The Wehrmacht had proven that tactical excellence could not compensate for strategic fragility. Every army that followed would place logistics at the heart of its doctrine. The study of Germany's defeat influenced NATO planning, Soviet military theory, and the rebuilding of European economies. The infrastructure built during the Cold War, highways, depots, standardized fuel systems, owed much to the recognition that war is sustained not by heroism, but by uninterrupted supply. The ghost of Germany's logistical breakdown haunted every modern general staff that studied its campaigns. Yet beyond the strategic and technical lessons, the collapse of German logistics carried a broader symbolic meaning. It represented the exhaustion of the idea of total control, the belief that human organization could dominate the material world indefinitely. The same efficiency that had propelled Germany's rise became the mechanism of its downfall when resources ran out and flexibility vanished. In the end, the Reich's armies were trapped not only by enemy fire, but by their own dependence on a system that could no longer move. The endless trains that had once signified power became stranded relics of overreach, standing silent in the ruins of stations whose names were already fading from maps. By the time Germany capitulated, its once vaunted war machine had been reduced to fragments of steel and ash. Millions of tons of vehicles, ammunition, and fuel lay scattered across Europe, abandoned or destroyed. The logistics that had once enabled rapid conquest now served as a monument to unsustainable ambition. In Berlin, as Soviet troops raised their flag over the Reichstag, the last supply orders of the German High Command were still being typed. Instructions for deliveries that would never arrive, to armies that no longer existed. The war of logistics had ended as it began, with numbers, charts, and schedules. But this time, they described absence rather than power. The story of how Germany lost the war of logistics is therefore not only a technical chronicle, but a portrait of the limits of industrial warfare itself. It reveals that the strength of a nation lies not merely in its weapons or soldiers, but in its ability to sustain them, feed them, and move them across vast distances. When that system collapses, even the most formidable army becomes inert. In 1945, the Third Reich discovered this truth too late. And, in the silence of its railways, the rusting of its tanks, and the starvation of its people, the final verdict was rendered. Germany had engineered the machinery of war, but it could not engineer the means to keep it alive.